welcome to Varn Blog. And today we're talking to Andrew Flores, aka the Big Signorelli, independent scholar of psychoanalysis and host of the Parallax Viewer. Not to be confused with the Parallax Views podcast. We'll deal with that later. But today we're talking about the relevance of psychoanalysis to left politics, its relationship to structuralism, and where Andrew thinks we are politically right now. But welcome aboard, Andrew. How are you doing today?
Good. It's good to be on here. I know a while back I had you on the channel, so it's good to be on the other side of things. It's only been a few times I've been interviewed. I should also plug that I'm also the co-host for another channel called The Vanishing Mediators, where we actually go over the seminars of Lacan, and we use The Vanishing Mediators because we don't want to be specifically psychoanalysis oriented. So we've been doing stuff like on Jameson and other Marxist texts, as well. But yeah, it's good to be here. How are you doing, Varn?
I'm doing okay. I'm healing up from surgery pretty well. Got a clean bill of health for now, knock on wood. Just drove through Wyoming this weekend because I needed to get out of Utah since it was pretty hot here. And by hot, I mean politically hot, not physically hot. It's actually kind of nice.
Yeah.
Weather-wise. I am about half an hour away from where Charlie Kirk was assassinated. I'm not the number of people that I know who saw that has gone from 4 that I knew of the first day to like almost 15. And they include people under 18. So I've had a lot to deal with in regards to that. But this will come out a few weeks after that, and we'll see how that all washes out. But I can tell you, it feels weird talking about psychoanalysis in a time that feels so theoretically fraught. So I guess we have to justify that before we even begin. So, like, why do you think the psychoanalytic relationship to Marxism is even interesting now?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, because I know, like, you've interviewed a fellow friend of the show, Daniel Tutt, who's really big on psychoanalysis. And I would say, yeah, I like have some interesting relationship theoretically in my own scholarship with psychoanalysis and Marxism. And I guess like it's a problem because I don't think of it as like a harmonious relationship. And you'll see like people like Gabriel Tupanamba, who are big Marxist and clinical theoretical Lacanian psychoanalysts. And they're able to sort of question the relationship between the two. But I guess to kind of condense it, I think there is an interesting relationship, not only historically, but also theoretically, in the sense that, like, the way I like to frame it is that what psychoanalysis does, not just in the clinic, as far as deal with individual patients who suffer from neurotic, psychotic symptoms, but theoretically, we're dealing with a bourgeois subject, the effects of bourgeois consciousness. For all the criticisms I do have of Zizek, I think he kind of makes a good point. And this comes from actually Lacan, about how Marx invented the symptom, not Freud, right? What that means is that, like, for lack of a better term, the infrastructure or the base and superstructure and the social relations create the consciousness. And it's never just this sort of perfect interpolated consciousness. It's rather like something that's always failing, and there's a sort of embedded discontent that comes out in a certain formation, whether it is in neurosis, which Freud discovered, at least as far as a cure, the talking cure, and a practice to deal with neurosis, and then Lacan dealing with psychosis and other forms of clinical structures that Freud wasn't able to deal with. But I guess, yeah, to cut a long story short, I think it aims at a sort of what in psychoanalysis we use the term libidinal economy, libidinal investment, which just goes beyond the realm of conscious thought or ideas. There's this sort of relationship that we are embedded in, even when we know what we are doing, or we don't know what we're doing in this social formation, we nonetheless repeat and undermine ourselves.
So, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, but I will say I've thought a lot about this contentious relationship between bourgeois subjectivity and what we might call future socialist subjectivity, and the tensions there, particularly when you try to get into other forms of psychology, like some of which are actually still ultimately rooted in some kind of psychoanalytic framework, but have moved really beyond that, like cognitive behavioral therapy, which was all the rage for about 15 years, and people are now like seeing its limits. Some other forms of modified analysis, and I have been very interested in this. I'm a Christopher Lash scholar. You can't deal with middle period Christopher Lash without having a pretty strong background. And classical Freudianism, Lacan doesn't come up. He's mentioned once in one footnote in all of Lash's work that I can find. And even there, Lash was picking one of the other French psychoanalytic theorists. I think it's that Lacan had a debate with. I can't remember her name right now.
Oh, yes. Daniel has written a lot about her. She's kind of a sort of like conservative classical Freudian. She wrote a text called Freud or Reich, which was like written around the time of, May 68 and the countercultural revolutions.
Right.
And yeah, I remember from what I heard, Lash had a strong correspondence with her, if I'm not mistaken. And
Lash, go ahead.
Yeah, Seminar 16 of Lacan, he actually mentions that in passing. And he is actually critical of not only her, but even of what she is critical regarding the libertine movement. Smergel is her name.
Yeah, Smergel. It's a very strange name. It doesn't sound French. It had the Smergel versus Lacan debates, and Lash basically uses Smergel a lot for his interpretation of Freud, because he has a much more classical, even conservative view of Freud, even than most, say, Kleinian or classical Freudians. It's very old school. And one of the things that interested me in regards to Lash, and I'll tie it in because I'm not just bringing up the stuff that I know just because I know it, is that Lash doesn't really see another subject beyond the bourgeois subject, even though he's very sympathetic to socialism. And this kind of leads him into weird mythic territory eventually. By the end of his life, he's getting in the Sorel and stuff like that. And I bring this up because it's always seemed to me that there's an interesting but tense relationship between psychoanalysis and Marxism, because there is, in some psychoanalytic frameworks, an attempt to almost trans-historicize what would be a 19th century bourgeois consciousness. And then there are attempts to move past that, say early Frankfurt School, Wilhelm Reich, that sort of thing. But it never quite squares back on political economy in the right way. And yet, I get where it comes from, because Marx's theory of mind is hard to articulate, because he basically has like what we would now call an emergentist theory of mind from Hegel, but it comes from materiality, and there's no explanation about why the human consciousness would do that in Marx. There's like just none. It's just, it's not. I don't know if he thought it was beyond him or he wasn't that interested. And I've read like every scrap of Marx I've ever been able to find in English, and some of it and a lot of it in German. And I don't know exactly what he thought the correspondence was, because he thought that while class consciousness was super important, it wasn't the thing that actually dominated every bit of your individual consciousness, because he totally recognized there are people who bucked their class positions, interest, and social relations and whatever. But he doesn't have a good explanation for why. He just acknowledges that it happens. And it's always seemed to me that in the very early 20th century, there was a realization that this needed to be addressed in Marxism. And if in my mind, no one's actually effectively addressed it. Because a lot of people who try to incorporate the Freudian still either transhistoricize the subject like Lash, or they kind of project more than you can probably say about a future liberated subject like Reich or maybe the Frankfurt School, although the Frankfurt School kind of gives up. Like Frankfurt School liberatory thought has kind of gone away by the end of Adorno. So, what do you see as at work here in that uneasy relationship? Because I agree with you. I don't think it's an easy relationship to entirely parse.
Yeah, and I think like regardless of the analytic body as a whole, like they're going to still operate regardless if they take in an account political economy. But I think like if certain analysts who consider themselves leftist, which there are a bunch, but they're not necessarily Marxist, and so like they try to overreach and be like psychoanalysis is political. Well, okay, like what does that even mean? Like what is politics? And it becomes ahistorical. I think it becomes epistemologically arrogant to think that they could latch on any form of psychoanalytic concept onto historical mediated relations, social relations, and kind of conceal the aspect of political economy. But I'm not sure if I think maybe in a sense having a Marxian political economy framework could assist with understanding like the distinction between like, okay, how does these symptoms arise in sort of more capitalist developed nations that have a strong consumer base versus those in the global south, or those that are under colonial domination. I think someone like Frantz Fanon, who I will admit I'm not as well read, but I know that there is a lot of literature regarding the conjunction of Frantz Fanon and Freud, or Frantz Fanon and Lacan, with psychoanalysis and colonialism. The name I'm thinking of is I think his name is Jose Gastambide. He has a work called Putting Freud on Fanon's Couch, and he talks about a lot of the distinctions between like more Anglo or American or European societies versus those that have suffered from the apartheid, or like those that are in the periphery. But one of the things I wanted to touch on regarding the subject, because I think it is important that you pointed out that the fact that's like, well, I think you said it was Lash who kind of transhistoricizes it to make it think like,
He's not the only one, though. I mean, to be fair,
there's
like
tons. Yeah, there's tons. But I think it's important, and we don't necessarily get it from Freud himself. We get it from Lacan, and it's reiterated by another French thinker who I'm influenced by, probably as much as Lacan. And he's a sort of like the effect of the structuralist school, but he's not a structuralist. He's actually one of these weird figures. His name's Jean-Claude Milner. He studied under Lacan. There was this journal that they started called Cahiers pour Analyse. It's called Concept and Form, where they try to merge Marxism, structuralist thought, and questions of what is epistemology, what is science, and psychoanalysis. And he is also studied under Chomsky. So he was one of the reasons why he brought like Lacan, and someone else brought Lacan to MIT. And he merged like Lacan's form of linguistics and semiotics with Chomsky. But he makes this important distinction in his work called In Search of Clarity. It's about Lacan and science. And that psychoanalysis, insofar as it deals with the subject, it's only the modern subject, which is the effects of modern science. And so he traces back the subject that psychoanalysis will eventually deal with the advent of what's called the subject of science, which is the cogito, which is developed by Descartes. Now, for Lacan, Descartes almost gets at the subject because it has to deal with this fact that science for him, modern science, which connects with Galileo, is predicated off of like this sort of world of deception, right? And this sort of negation of oneself, fundamental doubt. And that sort of gets lost in translation with the emergences of different sciences and etc. But it manifests in Freud's discovery of the unconscious, which is different from consciousness. Now, Freud never really had a sort of coherent theory of consciousness, despite being a neurologist. He was never like a psychologist. He was a physician in neurology and was focused on the nervous system. And he even developed his own theory of the neuron. But it was the unconscious that he discovered. And he tries to create like certain topology or topographies to talk about what the hell this thing, the unconscious, is. And for him, consciousness is more like a system that depends on perception, but also external reality and the external excitation that comes with it. It's very vague, but like in some ways that the material body, the relationship to the organs of the eye, the nervous system create a sort of buffer field in which like external reality, is sort of created for the organism. But he recognizes that what causes these psychopathologies that psychology can't account for is predicated off of a primary process that takes more precedence than what he calls a secondary process, which would be conscious life, and that is the pleasure principle. It's the ability to be able to discharge nervous excitation that's built up upon a memory process of trauma. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that, the word subject, the word consciousness are so convoluted because everybody means something different. It's like, what the fuck does the subject mean? Everybody talks about subject this, subject that. Structuralists want to destroy the subject. For Althusser, the subject is ideological, but the subject for Lacan, at least, is related to this unconscious that is sort of split by its like own symptom in the world. So some kind of groundworks right there for Lacan. And we could probably even get into like the relationship of structuralism, since I brought it up as well.
Well, and that's a good point. I mean, subjectivity and subjectness is difficult to talk about because a lot of people do what amounts to basic logical equivocations between what we might call subject 1 and subject 2, or subject 3 and subject 4, which is like subject as a subject of history, as a collective movement that becomes conscious of itself, coming from an aggregate into a collective, a la Marx and Hegel. That's one definition of subject. And that doesn't have that much to do with subject as in the subject of therapy or subject of this or that and psychoanalysis, except that they both at some level have to interact with an individual mind. But there's a lot of like very facile critiques of Marxism are like, value is blah 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 and subject is blah blah blah. And I'm like, but you're talking about something very different than what Marx is talking about. And what makes this particularly salient is this kind of tension comes up with Althusser, it comes up with the Lacanian Marxists, and it also comes up with the existentialist Marxists because it's important to Sartre, or Sartre, and a lot of them, Fanon too, because you have that lineage there. So I guess this actually does. I have to ask you a question that's come up on my show, but we can't assume that everyone on my show knows all these like deep dives. Like, how do you define structuralism in this Marxist context? Because another thing is people will look up structuralism and like I'll say, for example, I'm a functional structuralist, but that's not like what Althusser or Lacanian Marxists are talking about. So, what is a structure and how is structuralism related to what you're talking about?
Yeah. Okay. So I guess like in case like your audience isn't aware, I know you had what's his name? Cool dude, Nicholas Villarreal. He's big in the structural semiotic stuff as well, and Althusserian. So like for someone like Levi-Strauss and Mauss, like they're anthropologists. So for them, I would say, given my like sort of low res understanding, only because it relates to Lacan, structures deal with how these sort of tribes or societies or clans and kinships are formulated. And I guess for like Levi Strauss, at least, structure has to do with like elements of a given society, like what makes a society. And so like for him, he creates this sort of algebraic formula regarding the myths of all the different tribes that he's dealing with. And so I guess like for structure, it bridges upon this sort of French understanding of science regarding around like axioms and formalisms, like to sort of create not only an epistemology, but a sort of science, whatever that may be, upon certain formal, consistent definitions and axioms or conclusions. And in some ways that does translate into Lacan. And Lacan was friends with and is in some sense indebted to structural anthropology, which deals with the elementary formations of a given tribe or different clan or human society. But for Lacan, structure deals, I guess you could say, and this is where it might even get a little crazy too, between language on the one hand and discourse, right? Which that term already opens up a can of worms, because then you have Foucault and many other people that talk about this term discourse. But in Lacanianese, structure deals with how language and discourse are formulated around what he'll call his three registers or his three structural functions: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. And so why he chooses to do this is because he thinks it's implicit in Freud. Freud just didn't voice it, but he wants to get away from this sort of hyper symbolicized structuralism that can account for what he calls the subject, and get away from existentialist notions of subjectivity, because at least for him, existentialism deals with, like, even though they use the term subject, it's more not only phenomenological in the sense that it's dealing with experience, but conscious experience. And he wants to get away from any sort of philosophy of consciousness. And so the imaginary for him, in a theoretical way, deals with what is sensible, what is intuitive, and that echoes Kant. And then the symbolic is more along the lines of what we're sort of used to as a sort of a bond, a pact, a social relation, but it has a registering effect upon language. Now, the symbolic for him is not language, but there is a symbolic aspect to language, meaning that he'll use this term in seminar too when he defines the symbolic. The symbolic is like a computating machine. And in this seminar, he's really big on cybernetics, because he thinks that cybernetics almost gets at to what he thinks the unconscious and Freud gets at, and that the formal system of the symbolic is merely just a bunch of ones and zeros. It's a computation process in which when you have a certain combination, an effect comes out, right? Something emerges and something is produced. And he thinks that in some ways, the subject, which is equivocal to the unconscious in Freud, that's what he means by the subject, is the subject of the unconscious, which is structured like a language, and we'll get into that more, sort of has this combinatory mathematical effect of it's only by combining certain things that you could get a causal effect. And because it's structured like a language, Bruce Fink, a popular American Lacanian, says this combinatory mathematics, it's only when you combine certain things that an effect creates. So, like, for instance, it's different from a priori law because it's not something that is like you could preconceive without experience, but it's not empirical or posteriori. What it is that it's a rule that could only be generated by a combinatory effect, meaning we only know in the English language I before E except after C, because we combine all these letters and elements and rules to create this sort of linguistic effect. And so something emerges in this combinatory factor symbolically. And now the real, this one is more complicated because even it's a debate in Lacanians as far as like what that even means. But there's a real of the imaginary in which like there is a sort of inconsistent whole. And I should rewind back because why he talks about the imaginary, even though he's critical of consciousness, is that for Lacan, he has this experiment called the inverted bouquet, an optical schema in which you have a vase in which like the vase is upside down and the flowers are sticking up, and this rotating mirror, if it's in a certain geometrical location, you're able to see an upright vase with flowers sticking out. It's an optical illusion. And then in order for that image to stay, that you have to have another mirror in place from your vantage point of seeing. And he says that from the field of consciousness in which we're already emerged with in material reality, the ego comes about. And this ego is this optical function that is predicated off of what Freud called narcissism, right? And narcissism is a libidinal thing in which we have this sort of investment in our body. Like the baby is helpless, it's fragmented. Unlike animals, we don't really have instincts. We are sort of developed weird in which sort of, you know, like Freud's just saying like, you know, we depend on caregivers more than animals do. And so for Lacan, the ego, this imaginary function, this narcissistic function, is to create a sort of inverted totality or illusion of unity. And then the symbolic comes in and embeds prohibition. It embeds Oedipus. It embeds laws and machinic-like functions of these ones and zeros via structural linguistics, the signifier, which we'll get into more. But now going back, the real is what escapes these two processes. The real has to do with trauma. It has to do with one's pathological symptom, and it manifests in both these registers of the ego, which the ego tries to protect against the unconscious and even is at prey to the superego, which is a term I think Lash uses as well, which is very popular to Freud. It's like in the sense in which we sort of internalize this societal law that is handed down from our parents in a sort of pernicious way that produces guilt. And there's more sort of context in which we could break that down for Lacan compared to Freud or Lash. But the real, to put a succinct definition, is what escapes symbolization, or it returns to its place, meaning that in Freud, we have this concept that he discovers later on in his career called the death drive. And the death drive is what makes us repeat our traumatic experience in childhood development. It's our way of symbolizing using the symbolic order to recreate that scene of trauma, and we repeat it unconsciously. And so the real is tied into this way in which we do it within these other two registers, but what makes it real is that it cannot process symbolically, and the imaginary sort of is flawed in protecting against that. Our imaginary ego, our ego that sort of, you know, allows us to maintain this sort of illusion of unity and individuality. So that's pretty much for him how structure operates with these three registers. But then he'll later say on that his structure deals with discourse. And what he means by that is that discourse for him is what's caused by the subject of the unconscious and manifest in the clinic, because one of the rules in the clinic, in psychoanalytic clinic, is that when you go in, you lay on the couch, the one thing that you are granted is to say whatever's on your mind. You can't say everything, but you say what you at least can try to say. You're articulating your suffering, your entire life into one uncensored free association. And the subject of the unconscious is creating a discourse based upon symbolic processes to try to reimagine, remember all these traumatic events that are repressed. And so that's in another way where he'll talk about discourse. And then he has this whole other theory of discourse, which we don't have to get into, at least right now. But I mean, that's in a long-winded way the distinction between structural or structuralism in Lacan versus in like Levi-Strauss, and even like Althusser. In Althusser, that's a debate too, because like there's like Althusser of like what he'll call the conjuncture, and then Althusser of like overdetermination and contradiction, right? Is another thing.
Well, one of the issues with Althusser is like the way he uses certain terms. Like he borrows a lot of terms from Saussure and Lacan, but he completely defines them differently. And that can be somewhat maddening. Like he does it with diachronic and synchronic for him don't mean what they mean in Saussure. You know, the way he uses Lacan in my mind is somewhat idiosyncratic. And so, you know, I say this as a person, if anyone who knows the lore of my academic exposure to Marxism, is I was exposed to, I guess I was like 22, or no, 21, because I was a senior in college and asked to teach a section of Althusser to the class, and I got asked again in grad school, and I hated it because I wasn't given the context for how he was using terminology and how it was different from other standard. Like even overdetermination has relationship to the way it's used in general philosophy, but it doesn't mean the same thing in Althusser. It has a more both specific and broader meaning. Kind of the way that like reification has a more specific and broader meaning than Marxism than it does in like general analytic philosophy.
Right.
And so I have always struggled with Althusser. A lot of people, you know, my jokes about both Althusser and Lacan, and you might not like this, but it's like I understand individuals, Althusser and Lacan, so I understand like Fink's Lacan and Zizek's Lacan, but I don't understand Lacan. And with Althusser, I kind of feel the same way. Like I understand Nico Villarreal's Althusser, and I understand some of the way the British structuralists were using Althusser, and I understand how Althusser kind of inspired Foucault, but I don't actually know that I really get what Althusser himself was getting at in his own context. And I find this very, very frustrating because so many of the debates of academic Marxism in the 70s and 80s in particular are rooted in how you interpret the fight between Althusserians and Lucasians. Are Althusserians in let's say British historical Marxists like E.P. Thompson and R.H. Hilton and stuff like that. That, and unfortunately, when I came about in this world, both in my conservative period and in my radical period when I radicalized in my mid to late 20s, that was Marxism. That's the only Marxism people in America were really exposed to. We knew that China and Vietnam and Cuba had Marxists, but we had no idea really what that meant. And our Marxism was the fight between academics in the 80s. So it's interesting. And the reason why I bring that up is because these debates really defined a lot of people's exposure to Marxism 10, 15 years ago, even when Zizek was becoming super popular in the late aughts. But they don't so much define Marxism now. And so I was going to ask you, like, how have you translated that into engagements with other Marxists? Because this seems like a debate that meant a lot to some very nerdy graduate students, but hasn't meant a lot to, you know, people reading Lacerdo today or whatever, or left communist or anything like that. So, like, what's the intersection between the structuralism you're talking about and an actual practical Marxism as experienced by most people?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I mean, like, it's something that I'm sort of tethering with too, because I think, like, when you pointed out about, like, you know, you understand certain individuals' use of Althusser or Lacan, but like it's hard for you to understand, you know, them on their own terms. I think it is interesting because, like, when you look at Althusser, for instance, And I did the For Marx reading group with Daniel and Conrad Hamilton, who you had on the show recently for the Flowers for Marx project. He co-taught that reading group, and one of the things that he says is that Althusser was so like treading on water, trying to like bring psychoanalysis into the Paris Communist Party, and he would hide it under terms like overdetermination. Like that comes from Freud, and I think there's a footnote to which he says that, but he attributes it to, I want to say, Mao Zedong in that essay on contradiction over determination. And he'll actually continue to use it and is more explicit about the psychoanalytic component in the Reading Capital project. And then he has that whole essay on psychoanalysis, Freud and Lacan, in which he like talks about the relationship between Freud and Marx. And it is interesting thinking about even his relationship to psychoanalysis, because like he was very close to Lacan at a certain point, and I think there was a strong distance towards the end, especially after murdering his wife. But before that, like he actually brought Lacan into his own group, because Lacan was kicked out of the reigning body of psychoanalysis during the time, the International Psychoanalytic Association, the IPA. And then he founded his own school in the process. So it's like his 11th seminar is where like he becomes this big celebrity intellectual, and not just like a psychiatrist turned psychoanalyst that's having these sort of like low key esoteric seminars with analysts only. Like now he's talking to a bigger audience at the École Normale. But like for Althusser, like he'll use the term imaginary, which comes from Lacan, but he says that like the imaginary is like our ideological relation, or ideology is an imaginary relation to reality, or the social relations. And that becomes a huge debate with the sort of Lacano-Marxists that you're referring to, which are Zizek. And I wouldn't want to even say like Dolar, that comes out of the Ljubljana school, but then even a middle figure that's influenced heavily by Althusser, and you could say is like the sort of post-Althusserians, and influential to Zizek is Ernesto Laclau, who's huge on psychoanalysis, uses a lot of the sort of, for lack of a better term, Lacanian semiotics, like signifier, to talk about like how populist groups sort of entangle with one another based upon this idea of like floating signifier, and the way in which like an antagonism is built upon that. And we know that the problems of leftist populism has led to, and I think like for all Zizek's like contributions to, I guess, quote unquote Marxism and Lacanianism, I think that he's never really abandoned his Laclauianism. I think he still is embedded into some sort of populism as like a sort of emancipatory project. But I really think that Zizek's use of Lacan is way different from Lacan himself, because he tries to make this homology between Lacan and Hegel.
Which I just don't get.
Yeah, and I think, and Zizek has some good stuff when he talks about Lacan on his own terms, but as soon as he brings up like the Hegelian dialectic, I think it's like, this is very much of a far stretch, and it's only a Zizek thing. So like, I guess like when it comes to psychoanalysis and like practical Marxism, because you even mentioned Lacerda, it's like Lacerda is somebody that like I'm pretty influenced by. Like I wouldn't say like I'm a hardcore diehard like Lacerdian, but I would say like his class struggle work, his work on liberalism, Bonapartism have been very like.
I will say, as much as I have been a critic of the Western Marxism book, and I am mixed on the Stalin and Nietzsche books, right. I think his Bonapartism book is excellent.
Yeah.
Just before people come at me, I also think his book on Stalin has some Stalin apologia in there, but its basic point that don't use Stalin as just a way to avoid dealing with the problematics of communism and anti-communism is sound. Whether or not I agree with him on what on softening what Stalin did. But I say that because Lacerda is like really big right now, and he's theoretically, well, I mean, he's interesting because I've associated most European Marxist-Leninists with structuralism for a long time or with Eurocommunism. That's always been the two predominant, Marxist Leninist traditions out of Europe. I mean, there's others elsewhere that I have seen. And Lacerda has become super popular, I think partly for obvious, polemic reasons, but I also think partly because he's a way out of that binary where you're either an Althusserian or you're a Eurocommunist. So it's and so speaking to that, because Lacerda doesn't have a whole lot of truck with Lacan or Althusser, really.
No. Well, actually, so Conrad, to refer to him again, actually, it was in the middle of translating a very early essay on Marx and the State from Lacerda. And frankly enough, Lacerda was actually an Althusserian in his past.
Interesting.
Yeah. And it's quite frankly because, I think it's because he bounced from, two different Italian parties back in his younger years. And he was more, even though he's always accused of being a neo-Stalinist for whatever reason. I think it's mainly because of the Stalin book that you referenced. But he was more of a committed Maoist. And so now correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you have a stronger.
And today I think he's a Dungist, which is still a kind of Maoist. So
And so correct me if I'm wrong, because I know you have a stronger historical background in Italian communism. But from what I heard, that the Italian party, the Maoist party that he was a part of in his younger years, didn't really have a lot of, let's say, theoretical, philosophical figures to ground their praxis. And so for him, Althusser became a sort of figure in which he could ground some sort of theoretical binding to the movement at the time. And so Althusser became a huge influence on him theoretically. And even though he sort of distances himself from Althusser in the Western Marxism book, but even as early in the Class Struggle book, when he's criticizing Althusser for his humanism, his anti-humanism, he, I think, still maintains that fidelity with understanding contradiction and overdetermination, with his idea that class struggle, or a multiplicity of struggles that could be at least categorized into two processes. You have the workers and proletariat, the capitalists and the classical proletariat as far as worker goes in Marxism, and then you have struggles for recognition that take the form of the colonized, the slaves, and the slave revolts from Haiti up until now, to the women's and sexual oppression that were talked about with Marx and Engels, national liberation movements, and you can even have the trans oppression. And the list goes on, that these struggles for recognition, while they're not inherently, let's say, Marxist, they can't help but manifest at a certain overdetermined juncture as a class struggle in the form of recognition as a human struggle. And so I think right there is his implicit Althusserianism that still remains regardless of his distance because of anti-humanism.
Yeah, as I said, because even if we read him as a Marxist-Leninist in the socialism and Chinese characteristics / Dungist vein, there is a humanism implicit in that, and that's hard to square with Althusserianism. And yet, it did seem that most of the humanists in the Euro-communist parties, the British are different. I'm going to bracket them out. Ended up as Euro-communists. They didn't stay a normal, Marxist center, Marxist-Leninist of the 1950s, 1960s variety. And they also seem to be kind of baffled about how they should respond to anti-colonial movements. And I say that because, Fanon has become increasingly important in light of Gaza. Although I've always said that Fanon's context is both applicable to Gaza and not, in that the colonialism that Fanon is dealing with in Africa is settler, but it is not of the same kind of settler colonialism that you're dealing with in Israel, where you have you basically have an entire displaced population without a clear homeland to return to.
Right.
And that actually changes some of the dynamics of what Fanon is talking about. Right. And yeah, I do think there's a lot to be learned from Fanon. I also think he's also quoted very piss poorly by both his critics and his fans.
Yeah. And like, so, I'm not as heavy in Fanon scholarship, but like what I've noticed in a lot of the sort of psychoanalytic, psychology, camps that like want to focus on a sort of decolonial liberation aspect is that they mention Fanon, but they don't mention his Marxism or like how he was indebted to some sort of like political emancipation, and they only focus on race, which is not a problem, but it's just like it almost sort of like waters down the radicality of Fanon. And one of our mutual friends, comrade Bodale, is really big on the sort of militant influence of Fanon, in light of like also his Marx or not his Marxism, his psychoanalytic practice as well, which there's like a huge text that's referenced the least, but it's titled Freedom and Alienation, where he actually goes over a lot of his case studies, and I think some of the things that he concludes and sort of political strategies regarding like, institutions that handle psychiatry and psychoanalysis in a sort of like Marxian sense.
I would agree with that. I mean, Fanon's an interesting figure because he's definitely a Marxist. He's definitely a fairly orthodox Marxist in some ways. In other ways, he's not. But he's bridging so many different traditions because he's bridging existentialism with Lacanian psychoanalysis. He's bridging Marxism with those two things, which had already been attempted, frankly, before Fanon came around. But then he's wedding it all into anti-colonialism and decoloniality, to make up a word that's terrible. But yet you can't see him in the same way that you can see other decolonial thinkers, like, I don't know, like Chinua Achebe, are some of the more radical ones who even wanted to throw out like European languages and the concept of nation state because they were too European.
Right. Or systems people, Samir Amin, right, is like another like decolonial.
Yeah. Well, Samir Amin's interesting because he's a diehard Marxist, but man, does he not like Islamists, like at all. And it's weird for people to miss that because he wrote a whole book like arguing with Hillel Assad and some other people. And then during the Egyptian Revolution, he did not support the Brotherhood, kind of famously, and then went to, I believe, Senegal. So, and didn't come back. So it's, and I say that because he was very old at the time, but that was during my lifetime. I mean, personally, people have heard me critique his late text that he didn't finish because I was like, I don't even understand what this has to do with Marxism all that much. But he was a third worldist Marxist. But I always bring that up too, because Fanon and Samir Amin don't fit a lot of the other third worldist Marxist theories at all. I mean, you got
Rodney would be another example, like Walter Rodney, who's like someone was more classical to the Marxist-Leninist project.
Right. And not like one of those Marxist-Leninist Maoists who thought there was no such thing as a proletariat in the developed world or anything like that. Like Samir Amin would not say that. And so it's it creates an interesting space to kind of deal with, because you are trying to deal with these, to bring it back to the psychoanalytic notion, very different subjectivities that have very different contexts, and thus their relationship to neurosis and psychosis in a Freudian context, if you believe that, is going to be different than a European or post-European settler state.
And
relationship to those things. Go ahead.
I think so there's two thinkers that I think that have, like, because your initial question was about like bridging the gap between sort of structuralism and sort of a political Marxist practice. And I would say the person that kind of, well, there's two people, but the first one that deals with more of the French structuralism, or at least the aftermath of that scene, would be Alain Badu. And well, Alain Badu slash his counterpart, who I think I find more...
Laurel?
Sylvan Lazarus. I don't know if you've...
Oh, right. Yeah, Lazarus. Okay, got it.
Yeah.
So Laurel's not a Marxist at all, but go ahead.
No. He has that anti or non-Badu or anti-Badu and like non-Marxist thing. Yeah. And he also was very critical of Althusser as well, if I'm not mistaken.
Extremely.
Yeah, but like I think like for all the criticisms of Badu's, like I guess you could say Marxism, or like in some sense like from like orthodox Marxists where they'll say, well, he doesn't really talk about political economy. Fair enough. But I do think that like what I like about Badu is that like, well, in his early work, like Theory of the Subject, he's able to use sort of Lacanian terms like impasse at the site of formalization, which is like another definition of the real. And then the understanding of the subject as like scission, meaning like he's using the sort of Maoist dialectic of like the one always comes into two or divides into two, right? Unity of opposites ends up dividing in itself, to show like that like politics happens with the people or with the masses off of like a structurally embedded exclusion. And I think during that time he's dealing with like the problem of immigration, which like he thinks like the immigrants, the migrants, etc., like are these sort of excluded people, or like just in general the state, no matter what, no matter how much the bourgeois state tries to encompass a totality of things, that there's always something left out. And I think that's this example of like what the possibility of the proletariat is based upon like the excluded thing in the dialectic. But another example would be like his way of like categorizing philosophy off of the four conditions. And that's like, what does he say? Science, art, politics, and love. Now, I like the politics one, and I've more read more of Badu's metapolitics than majority of his other works. And I find that like surprisingly really clear. And metapolitics he actually gets from Rancière, which is another... Jacques Rancière is one of the students of Althusser. But like he opens the book with like a critique of Hannah Arendt and Hannah Arendt's lectures on Kant, by, you know, privileging Kant as the philosopher for political philosophy. And he's talking about how like we need to disassociate philosophy from politics, because politics is its own unique thought and its own unique system, and how all philosophy does, the history of modern philosophy and politics, is that it creates this sort of division between the spectator and the actors of history, into which that, you know, politics is only viable for those spectators who deem it worthy of debate. Because Hannah Arendt's sort of politics is that politics is useful because it stimulates debate. And so like going back to Lacerdo, I think one of his criticisms of Hannah Arendt is that like, oh yeah, politics is good for because it produces debate. So in her logic, you know, she appreciated the Jim Crow laws because it stimulated debate. You know? Which is not actually that unfair of a characterization of some of her positions, particularly when she like writes about discourse and Aristotelianism and ignoring that like that's all based on having a class of slaves. Yeah, like, exactly. Yeah, like... and even in Lacerdo's class struggle book, he criticizes her for saying that like, you know, exploitation, because this is where she's like really critical of Marxism, that exploitation are not these sort of economic, social categories, but if there's any form of exploitation, it's by the forces of nature, to which only some of us are exploited based upon some natural reason. And therefore, like the masses that consider themselves exploited are only that, I'm kind of paraphrasing, are only that way because of just natural law. It was just nature's destiny. And at the same time, these oppressed people, these slaves, are not free thinkers. So therefore, they're not the sole source of a revolution. We need free thinkers that are, you know, able-bodied and not bound by the natural law. It's this weird sort of... Right. I mean, it's a bourgeois revolutionary argument that's actually just straight up Aristotle.
like it's straight up Aristotle's Politica, like, but like in a really like I'm like, it took a long time for people to notice it. I'm like, she's arguing that there's such a thing as a natural slave if you actually pay attention. But which like, I'm actually like, that's sub-liberal, really. Like,
right. Yeah. So I mean, that's a bit of a digression, but like back to the metapolitics, it's like he says that, like, you know, in some cases, like Hannah Arendt, who in privileging her reading of Kant, like pretty much like he's arguing that like political philosophy is like fallen into this sort of way in which they don't understand politics. What they do is they politicize the ethical and make certain ethical demands regarding what is to be done. And so by this division of the spectator versus the actors of history, you can, in his words, you can make ethical demands and judgments of taste based upon your reaction of the Jacobins by thinking that the French Revolution in and of itself to spectate was beautiful, but the actors of that historical event, the Jacobins, are you could condemn them. They're contestable. And so like, and also in her mind, she says, politics produces debate, and that means that we have to like have a judgment of what is politics. So for her, Nazis aren't political, so they don't need to be debated for in her logic, and that's what Badu says. But metapolitics for him is like, okay, politics is a specific thought. And so he relies on that other figure, Sylvan Lazarus, to talk about how politics is rare. And when it happens, it's spontaneous by the people, by the so he uses the term people because he thinks that the term masses, which comes from Mao, the class or the proletariat, which comes from like Lenin and Marx, is overly saturated and it's hard to even use today because what does that even mean? But
I feel that way about people, though. But
yeah. Well, he says it like this, like, you know, in his sort of two statements of the anthropology of the name, which is Sylvan Lazarus' text. He says people think, and thought is like a relation of the real. And so what he wants to do is create like a sort of political thought in which like how thought has a relation to politics. Because he says that like, okay, politics, you know, in the modern sense and in the way in which is oriented by people, you know, Saint-Just is like the first political figure. Then he attributes it to Marx. I forget specifically how he labels Saint-Just as like a figure. I think because of the way in which he's able to separate the sort of the ruling elites in France at the time from the people that want liberty, equality, and egalitarianism, or liberty, equality, fraternity. And then Marx, because Marx is able to understand the political aspect of the workers' movement. And then he says Lenin makes a major break and has his own political thought because of the way in which he, in his What Is to Be Done, formulates a new understanding of politics. And then for him, Mao is sort of the last like periodization of a political thought with the masses, right? And so for him, he's trying to think like Badu, what would a political thought look like? Because for them, politics as a thought is interior, and it has to be sort of emerge in its own sort of particular position in conjuncture. It does not need to rely on the state. It's because he says state does not produce political thought, right? And then even, this is crazy, he's criticizing the party as well. So like the vanguard are another form of exteriority in which no matter what end up sort of relying on the state. And so that's the sort of way in which, like, you know, like maybe their prescriptions are not totally 100% like something I would necessarily agree with, but I do think it allows me to think, all right, are we thinking in terms of maybe some type of mass movement or people that are organized organically, or are we relying on the state? Are we relying on workers' demands insofar as that they appeal to some sort of state policy, right? Or is it something organic?
So brings me. Go ahead, finish your thought though.
So I'll just say it, but the last thing I want to get into regarding the psychoanalytic side, because Badu only focuses on like a small bit of psychoanalysis, but there is an Argentinian thinker named Leon Rosichner that I'll get into later on regarding his explicit use of psychoanalysis. to talk about how power and military power subjugate us. But go ahead.
No, I was about to say, because one of the interesting things, if we both take Lacerda and Badu as two ways, like post-Althusserian goes on, you have Lacerda with a humanist view that also departs from, frankly, all other Marxism. I think Lacerda knows this. This is not him. This is not an unknown revision where he says we're not going to get rid of the state. We shouldn't even try to. Hegel gives us a good reason, philosophy of right, not to do that. And whereas Badu considers himself a Marxist, but when I first read Metapolitics, I'm like, how is this guy not an anarchist? Just straight up. Like, it's not just that he wants to get rid of the state. Like, we don't want to rely on the state even now. And that's a big jump from, traditional Leninism of any variety. But they both seem to come out of like how we view assumptions in relationship to Hegel and how we view this as subjectivity. So I was going to ask you, like, what is the intersection between you're thinking about the state and you're thinking about psychoanalysis? Because one thing you can say about both Freud and Lacan is like there's some implicit relationship to the thought that leads to two states, like in The Big Other, The Great Father, those kind of things, symbolic castration, blah, 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 that has a tie to development of state forms in psychoanalysis, but it's really underdeveloped. And so what is the intersection of psychoanalysis and the state for you, particularly when you look at these like post-psychoanalytic Marxists who take this in radically opposed directions from some of the same theories?
Yeah, and so this is going to bring me into the Leon Rosichner point, who I think, as far as psychoanalysis explicitly goes, he has a really convincing way to, support the, I guess, the need for a sort of psychoanalytic theory for Marxism. Mm-hmm. So I guess like for the state, I would like to also add in like the family as a sort of institution, because one of the biggest things that psychoanalysis talks about is the family. And in the way in which, like, you could say the family is a sort of nucleus of that and of culture and of the law, which, we are imbued with. It's the first social relation we have. And of course, we could bring in Lash with the problem with family because, the nuclear family isn't as stable, these days as it was in the sort of Victorian era that Freud was talking about. But Freud has this underappreciated book called, Group Psychology and the Ego, in which he kind of critiques Gustave Le Bon and his understanding of group psychology, because like group psychology in Gustave Le Bon, which also is influenced by Nietzsche, as far as like Nietzsche goes, he's a form of group psychologist. Even Alexis de Tocqueville, with pathologizing the groups, pathologizing the masses as like inherently herdist, like a herd mentality. So like Freud and Rosichner, specifically in his book called Freud and the Limits of Bourgeois Individualism, tackles this text of Freud's group psychology. And so Freud talks about this notion of artificial groups. And artificial groups are any group that are formed by the state, church, and the army, and any sort of ancillary group of the state. And so I guess the family would also be part of that. And in the way in which like group identifications come about, in which, of course, there is a sort of pathology, there's a sort of paternal identification that we see from group leadership, bureaucrats, etc., that bind these groups together and create this sort of hypnotic trance. And this is also the text where he develops in German this term Einziger, which is called a trait of identification, and for Lacan, he'll call it the unary trait. And this is something that's passed down from, the law of the father, the big other, symbolically. And it doesn't have to be a literal father. It's just like whoever, passes down the symbolic law that marks you. But in the way in which there is this logic of identification. and we could see how like the artificial groups operate today with like MAGA in America, like the MAGA groups and the MAGA communists with Dugan, or like even today, in which there's this weird identification with Charlie Kirk, in which that's caused a sort of group mentality, and it doesn't have to be necessarily an identification based upon loving the person. It's one of ambivalence. But Freud has this one notion that he never really touches upon that Leon Rosichner talks about, and that is the spontaneous group. So Freud has this idea of the spontaneous group that comes about, and he does, I think, liken it to the revolutionaries. But we know how Freud was always hesitant to give any sort of love and prospect to revolutionary groups, and his sort of wishy-washy feelings towards communism and other anti-capitalist groups. But despite some of those like sort of criticisms of Freud's personal life, as I think he's just more of a sort of like centrist liberal. He's not really, I don't think he's a conservative at all, nor is he really progressive. And I think the same thing about Lacan. Lacan was really well read in Lukács and other in Marxist texts, but I don't think he was like a great Marxist reader. I would just say that he never stopped reading Marxism, but he wasn't definitely a friend or foe of the revolutionary groups. Leon Rosichner, again, he was an Argentinian Marxist. He studied under Merleau-Ponty, and one of the things that he gained from phenomenology was like understanding Schiller, I think it's the German Max Scheler. We talk a lot about affect and guilt, and the military group of the dictatorship around the time in Argentina that he was living in were reading that stuff to understand terrorism, and to be able to create an affect of guilt and servitude within the atmosphere of Argentina. So like a lot of his polemics in using psychoanalysis are against the dictatorship that he was living under, and even the Peronismo. I think it was like another group that he's very kind of ambivalent of, and then also Althusserianism, like Laclau, who's critical of populism, but he uses psychoanalysis to pretty much understand how one's subjectivity, for lack of, he doesn't really use the term subjectivity, he uses the term corporality. How one's corporality and how we, are immersed in the social formation, how these sorts of traumatic symptoms under terror, under dictatorship, form these identifications. And he thinks that, bourgeois subjectivity, and this is why in the beginning I said, psychoanalysis deals with the bourgeois subjectivity. That's a Rosichner line, because he thinks that there's a limit to bourgeois subjectivity and its quest for individualism, because he thinks that the capitalist mode of production and the social relations are something that Freud implicitly tracks by showing that its techniques of, discharging suffering or dealing with suffering, whether it's, the appropriation of art, of science, and of religion, only do so much, and that neurosis comes about as a last resort. And so psychoanalysis identifies with that. But he thinks that it's not enough that we deal with neurosis, that there is another form of thing that emerges, and that's a sort of revolutionary consciousness. And he thinks that in the spontaneous group, that Che Guevara fits the role of a leadership of a non-paternalistic or imaginary identification of a revolutionary group during the close of the book. But I think he's ultimately a really interesting figure that's able to use an exegesis of Freud's specific text on civilization discontent, group psychology, and some of his introductory lectures to talk about the unconscious, subjectivity, the superego, in which he aligns as this sort of personalization of the artificial groups of the state, and the way that it's passed down in the family to keep one in this sort of trapped relationship of the ideological rule, for lack of a better term.
Okay. Well, I mean, you actually did something that I was hoping you'd do, but I was going to ask you if you didn't, which is to tie some of this into actual practical concerns today. So it seems like you think that the subject formation has gone awry. One of the reasons I got fascinated with Christopher Lash is I find his early books to be sort of standard socialist historiography of an imminent critique of the American left, the beginnings of the new left, the progressive movement, etc. But by the time we get into his middle period, Freud becomes so crucial to him. But you go through that in Haven and the Heartless, Worldism and Family, and then the response to that gets into deeper in this Freud in the next two subsequent books, which is Culture of Narcissism, and then The Minimal Self, which clarifies what he means in Culture of Narcissism. And he's one of the reasons I bring that up is he is innovative in this sense, even though he doesn't really get past the bourgeois subjectivity of Freud, is that he does tie Freudian concepts to periods of political economy. So, for example, the culture of narcissism is about a secondary narcissistic attachment to institutions that he sees developing in Fordism in specific, which is why a lot of people misread that book because they don't get that. They think it applies to it's like a general cultural critique. It's not. He's saying that the reason why this is a culture of narcissism is there's an over-identification with groupings and identities, and it started with an over-identification with the firm and not being able to tell your separation as an individual from your separation from the firm, and then it goes on to other identities and expands out. And by the time you get to the minimal self and the beginnings of neoliberalism, which he was later called that, he thinks that you're in primary narcissism, so you can no longer tell yourself from anything. So, and those are classical Freudian categories, right? But he ties them to political economy, and that's kind of unique. So, he's talking about political economy with Fordism and culture of narcissism and the way it's winding down. And as neoliberalism is beginning to get amp up to that crisis, he starts talking about a shift from the social modality, not like the clinical modality, but from the social modality, from secondary narcissism to primary narcissism. Now, again, for those of my audience who don't know all these distinctions, these are not distinctions recognized by the DSM.
No,
right?
These are Freud.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
these are Freud. These are not modern psychology. So a lot of people his narcissism doesn't meet narcissistic personality disorder. I'm like, narcissistic personality disorder as defined in the DSM didn't exist when Lash started writing about this stuff. He was going off of Freud. But the reason why I find that so interesting today is, and this is I am asking you to speculate, and that is always dangerous, but you brought this up in people over-identifying with tertiary figures like Charlie Kirk or Charlie Hebdo or various forms of terrorist, which Charlie Kirk obviously isn't, are right now, more than any time in my life, actually, Taylor Robinson, who comes from my state, is his politics seem inscrutable. And if you go into right-wing world, he's a leftist. If you go into left-wing world, everyone's claiming he's a groyper. There is only circumstantial evidence for either. And it doesn't really seem to be clear, but it does seem like you're dealing with fragmented selves that other people want to attach to parts of. And the reason why I bring that up to what you just said is that, okay, so you have this idea of the revolutionary leader who you don't have a paternalistic relationship to, but it does seem like we're living in an age of projected paternalism that it isn't upon leaders, really. It's people being made into a social symbolic imaginary or something.
Mhm.
So how would you apply Lacanian psychoanalysis to that? Do you think it's dangerous to apply Lacanian psychoanalysis to that? Like, is there a way in which the stuff we've talked about today could help people come to terms with what they're seeing?
Yeah, and like I think you pointed out one thing that these, if you could call them, because like in the clinical aspect, we would call them diagnostic structures, not categories, because it's not a one size fits all. And the radical take about the structures of neurosis, hysteria, perversion, psychosis is that they're a sort of ethical choice to make to guide the treatment. But I do think that they do kind of help out in a way to talk about, again, what we were reiterating with like paternalistic identification. Now, like my reading of Lash is very low. I actually just started reading the Culture of Narcissism, but I had to put it down a while back just because of like my own Lacan, commitments. But it's interesting that you mentioned how like he says that at least what is it? The Culture of Narcissism in the Fordist period, we have the secondary narcissism, and then in Minimal Self, and then the more neoliberal thing, we have a more primary narcissism, which I think is interesting because, well, one, even though he does use a lot of Freud, I've heard from Daniel that a lot of his readings of psychoanalysis come from also Otto Kernberg, who's more of
more Kernberg than probably Freud, honestly.
Is radically different than the Lacanian tradition. But I find it interesting how he makes this leap between secondary and primary. So let's rewind before we even get into that. Like, what do those terms mean? I mentioned narcissism earlier with the imaginary. And so for anyone who has at least some vague familiarization with Lacan, you'll probably hear of the more infamous mirror stage. The mirror stage essay deals with the Freudian notion of primary narcissism. Freud developed the theory of narcissism around 1914 or 1915 in his career with his research into psychotic disturbances, paranoia, and what was called dementia praecox back then, now called schizophrenia. And it was also a debate between Jung, because Jung thought that the theory of libido was psychical, and it goes into his weird theory of the archetypes, versus sexual in Freud. And so in Freud's 1905 and constantly revised essay, three essays on sexuality, he only has two structures of sexuality. He has the autoerotic, and then he has the object love, which gets read in like so many different ways in non-Lacanian Freudianism and object relations. But autoerotic has to deal with the fact that like this goes to what like he calls like the fact like infantile sexuality, that the child has a form of sexuality, but it's not like they are imbued with it. Like it's like their sort of like philosophical like essence, like it's not their essentialist thing. It's the fact that like the way that children develop, the autoerotic is like this sort of way in which they're trying to form a body. So like they're like this like temporary erogenous zones, and he will liken it to a feature of a masturbation because it's sort of self-satisfactory, meaning like children suck the thumb or babies suck the thumb because it's just an erogenous zone of constant satisfaction. The breast is not enough for oral satisfaction or hunger. There's something driven like that needs some sort of satiation, and then he'll apply other parts of the body and use weird, biological metaphors. But then you have object love, and that aligns with what he'll later talk about with like how sexuality sort of interferes with puberty, and how sexuality should be aligned with puberty, but something that sort of is residual and maintained even in the puberty aspect of biological maturation. And object love deals with something that we see in the Oedipal complex of the rivalry with the father for the mother's love and the prohibition of incest. But narcissism is that middle period. Narcissism is when the image of the body, or the body as an object as a whole, is taken into account. But it seems like for Freud, it's very transitional. But for Lacan, this is a structural moment that inaugurates the ego, right? The ego, which thus for Freud creates a conflict between libidinal instinct of satisfaction and the ego's drive for self-preservation, and the way in which these two sort of systems are at odds with one another. And so narcissism is this moment in which like libido then finds a new route via the ego. Now, secondary narcissism comes from something traumatic, and that's where psychosis comes in. So I find it interesting how Lash will say that there's a secondary narcissism in the Fordist, but then in the sort of neoliberal, it's a primary narcissism. Because I would say that in our social fragmentation, if you could call it such, that these moments like Charlie Kirk or whatever we see happening in America that causes a schism seems to have a paranoia with it and a sort of persecutory function that resembles secondary narcissism, that resembles a form of psychosis in which there's a threat from the other, right? And so like I feel like, because secondary narcissism is like this way in which like it creates a delusion, it creates a narcissistic reality that's only interior to that subject suffering from psychosis. And it's a sort of embodied delusion, a paranoia, erotomania, this sort of knowing everything, that I know that the government has all these secrets to, try to spy on me, but I only tell a selected few, and like I create this sort of schism for anybody that I think is working for the government. These sort of paranoid delusions, like there's aliens that are trying to, hack into my nerves, like these sorts of delusions. But I think collectively there is something in which like that mimics conspiratorialism, like where it's like now for some reason active shooters are now being homologized with trans people, right? How trans people are somehow, active shooters now, and we should worry about trans people trying to shoot us up. To then like the person that's killing Charlie Kirk somehow works for the Democrats, but now we just realize who it was, and he's somehow some sort of conservative person. And so like these sorts of schisms in which create a projection and a paranoia, I think are more secondary narcissistic that bridge psychosis compared to like a primary narcissism in which it's more dealing with this sort of bodily investment.
Well, yeah, I think he was really focused on the way that early neoliberal libertinism seemed to be totally embedded in the body.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So like those movements like a Wilhelm Reich or like a Deleuze and Guattari, definitely like this sort of romanticism of the pre-Oedipal. They think that like there's something unique about like the pre-Oedipal sexuality of a child.
But it's funny what you bring up, because one of the things I've said to people about Lash, whether or not we agree with his understanding of Freud through Kirchner, is that the implication of both Lacan and Lash today would be we are no longer in a social phase of narcissism, we're in a social phase of psychosis.
Yeah, and that's
Go ahead.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because that debate of psychoanalysis to be able to sort of prescribe a sort of state of affairs of the political climate and the social climate is huge between the Slovene school, so like Zizek, Alenka, Dolar, versus the school, the clinical school developed by Lacan's son-in-law, Jacques-Alain Miller, where the Millerians will say in their fancy Lacanian jargon that we lived in a sort of generalized foreclosure where like the symbolic law, then the name of the father, the paternalistic function is rejected and foreclosed. So we live in a sort of psychotic state, versus Zizek, who will say like, no, I think like capitalism has brought about a more perverse society of like a superegoic injunction to enjoy, not to renounce. So there's like an interesting debate between the two. And I think I don't like the debate because I think it's sort of like a false dichotomy that could like conflict, like that conceals a lot of like the bigger, broader aspects like political economy and other things. But I will say I do find that in these instances of like the Charlie Kirk thing, and even like with conspiracies that still go on, I think there is more of a psychosis and a loss of narrativization to be able to cognitively map. I know Frederick Jameson is the one that uses that term, cognitive mapping. He'll say that conspiracy theory is the cognitive mapping for the the working class. And like, but I think like because of the way in which social fragmentation occurs in bourgeois society, I do think that secondary narcissism or paranoia or like some sort of psychosis seems to be like the default modus operandi, if anything, if I were to psychoanalyze things today. That's just my take.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting. One of the things I always like to point out to, like, particularly when I want to antagonize Conrad Hamilton and Daniel Tutt simultaneously, is to just say that, like, ultimately the Althusserians and the Lukashians, for all their disagreements, actually come to the same damn conclusion about the destruction of region.
Right.
Like,
well, it's actually interesting, like, reading Althusser, like, one of the things, like, for regardless of like his sort of abandonment of Hegel, I do think that, like, in his polemics, like, he does make some good points about, like, if there is a sort of concern of a destruction of reason in Althusser, in which he diagnoses empiricism as like the dominant mode of like politicizing or creating some sort of epistemology, and he thinks that's problematic, and I think that's pretty valid to be able to, like, say, like, we need to kind of step away from this sort of empiricism of trying to abstract some sort of essence or notion from empirical reality, and because it kind of it ends up conforming to some sort of idealism. And he talks about that since like the For Marx project, which I think like that Althusser, because I think like the Althusser of the For Marx, the Reading Capital, and the ISA project are legit Althusser. I think that's good Althusser. I think he does become problematic when he gets into his aleatory metaphysics.
All that, like, weird Spinozian non-certainty stuff.
Yeah. And because I think he's very much uncertain about the epistemological break, where to locate it, and like the abandonment of Hegel. But I think other than that, like, his understanding of, like, at first it's all right, philosophy is ideological, and we need to develop a science from what he calls his three generalities, in which, like, the generalities are like a way in which notions and theoretical practices could come about from the fact that, like, okay, unlike science and its sort of empirical fidelities, we're not dealing in a world or a field of raw material. Everything is already embedded in the conceptual and the ideological. So to become scientific is to create something that is not only consistent in its axioms, but it could be able to account for its own origin within the ideological field. So that's what he's trying to think Marxism anew as a theoretical practice and as a sort of supposed science. And of course, the other one, the spontaneous philosophy and the lectures on science are pretty good. And I think, like, that is good. That to me, that's a pretty good Althusser right there, because he's consistent. He's working through a lot of the problematics of Marx. But, like, you're right. Once he gets into this weird, like, uncertainty thing and Spinozistic thing, it's like, well, I don't know what you're doing over there, buddy.
Yeah, I know Nico gets a lot, friend of the show, Nico Villau, gets a lot out of that period of Althusser. And that's the period where I'm like, it seems like he's responding to real science, but then I go in and I'm like, but not really, though. I mean, in the sense that I'm like, well, go ahead.
I was just gonna say the last thing, because, like, I think I made it that distinction earlier, but it's like the bandwidth of science ends up becoming smaller, and I get this from Conrad. Conrad was mentioning this. It's like, he privileges science as something distinct from ideology, but then in the ideology, the ISA essay, he will say that all subjects are subject of ideology. Well, then it's like, okay, then if that's the case, how do you account for the subject of Marx or a subject of Galileo or whatever?
Right.
If all subjects are subjects of ideology, whence does Marx?
Why is there change ever?
Why is there change? And so I think he's trying to rework that to realize, well, no matter what, I could tell you that something is the case, but why the case and why the need to change is something else, and that we will have to rely on an ideology of some sort. And so this is where we get into the distinction, which this is always an untalked about essay, because he has at the end of the For Marx book a question concerning humanism, And so there is the distinction between theoretical humanism, which he's critical of, for various political reasons, but practical humanism is something that he will advocate for, as far as like that is the sort of ideological thing that we may have to use from that large bandwidth. If our science is a small bandwidth, we will have to extract some ideology or some humanism to be able to fight for. So I would say that's like the untalked about Althusser.
Yeah, it's his. We need to do conceptual humanism, but I mean, I will say that was my other problem with Althusser. It's if I took his ideological critique as totalizing, then his aleatoric materialism, it seems like a way out of that until you think about it. Then you're like, but then you're saying that change is just random.
Yeah.
And then what's the purpose of a revolutionary subject or any of that if change is just stochastic?
Yeah. It's like very Socratic, like
right
contingency.
Right. So it's like he thought himself into a corner. Did he kind of, the way he got out of that corner was in some ways worse than how he got there. Right. But I'm sure Nick Avira will come on and tell me I'm wrong about this, but this has been my reading since I was like 25. But I do think it's important to like play up these theoretical debates actually do sort of matter. I mean, and when people talk about, I was bringing this up, for example, I would say both Lacerda and Althusser are Maoists, right? For example, and Badu's explicitly a Maoist, but Althusser like was a crypto Maoist because he didn't really want to leave the French Communist Party after the Sino-Soviet split, but he clearly was taking Mao's side on a bunch of stuff and like admitted it late in life that he was. And I find that interesting because people will try to use this ideological genealogy to like discern what people's stances are gonna be, and it doesn't work. It like you cannot like. I'm not saying this just because this is all personalist. I'm also saying this in like there's enough ambivalence and ambiguity in most of these theories that you can take them in radically different directions legitimately with citing the original source legitimately. So textual analysis will never settle the problem for you. You need something else. And for me, it is like a mixture of psychology, maybe a little bit of psychoanalysis. I'm not as into it as you are, but and historical materialism and historical situationism, not just a bourgeois society, but the way Marxism responds to bourgeois society to be able to deal with all this stuff. Because if you're just like, oh, you have the right ideology, I'm like, well, all these people actually had similar ideological presuppositions, philosophical motivations, etc. And in just those three cases, and we're not even talking about all the people you brought up today. Yeah. We haven't even dealt with the Frankfurt School. Like, they all went in radically different directions. Yeah. Right. And then when you bring in like, okay, non-Lacanian Freudian Marxist so that's going to be the Frankfurt School, Lash. There's probably some of the value theory school, I think, touches into this stuff. Or no, value critique, not value, work critique in German, but Werk critique in German. There's all these kinds of divisions, and I think a lot of people right now are coming to Marxism with a very new radicalized understanding, but is also in some ways, and I don't mean this as a criticism, actually, it is always going to be true when you're dealing with large-scale, newly radicalized groups that they're not going to have a very nuanced view of the history of the material, because why would they? They haven't been like steeped in it for 20 years of their life and have it drive them slowly insane. Yeah. So like, you know, I do sometimes find that like some of these nuances like fly over people. But it is important to understand, and I don't think it's easily reconciled. I mean, we brought up all kinds of people today. A lot of them have been on my show, and a lot of them are all Marxism and psychoanalyst people. But like Gabriel probably doesn't agree with Daniel. doesn't agree with Conrad, doesn't agree with you, and yet they're all kind of allies too. Like, and they all deeply respect each other. And I think that's one of the things you kind of have to deal with in this space. So I wanted to like have you speak to that. Like, you've been studying with a lot of these people. I mean, you participate in workshops with Daniel and Conrad, and I think you've been in some sessions that Gabriel has participated in. So, how have you addressed, you know, this kind of like productive tensions between these thinkers?
Yeah, I actually haven't personally worked with Gabriel, but I do like his work on the desire of psychoanalysis, because I think it's a strong intervention against the sort of disavowed politics of the clinic and the institution as a whole, and the sort of class dimension of it, in which, like, in some cases, like, there is a sort of charity aspect of the Analytic Institute, because, like, unlike, you know, psychology, like, there's this interesting relationship of psychoanalysis in which, like, the fee can be negotiated, but like the class dimension is that, like, okay, those that could afford it get the sort of luxuries of being able to be clinicians one day, which is those that can't afford it, yeah, they get their prices negotiated, but they're still barred from that extra, you know, luxury or access of participating as clinicians. And he just talks about the history of Lacanian psychoanalysis. But yeah, like, I participate with Daniel a lot. I would say I agree with a lot of Daniel's takes. I would say, you know, textual analysis.
Even though he's a Lacanian?
Yeah, like, yeah, you know, so, like, it's funny, like, I wouldn't even consider myself an Althusserian. I've read a lot more Althusser than Lukács. But I would say, like, you know, I do find Lukács kind of fascinating, and you know, trying to reread History and Class Consciousness again, as well as Destruction of Reason, which I know is like the most like underread one and always like dismissed as Stalinistic, you know, by Adorno.
I would say, yeah, it's pretty underread. Although honestly, some of a lot of late Lukács, not just Destruction of Reason, is not read. It's like people pretty much stop at History and Class Consciousness. And maybe read his On Tailism, but like that's usually where people start. Like, I read his stuff on Goethe. Like, it's and frankly, if I'm honest with you, I don't like History and Class Consciousness all that much. I think the final essay is bad. Like his version of reification is just as totalizing as anything out of Althusser. But I did not read Destruction of Reason for a very long time because it was, quote, Stalinistic and not worth reading. And then when I finally did read, and you know, it's incredibly long, so I will not say that I've read all of it, and I disagree with him on a few things, like I disagree with him on Wittgenstein. But I do think like that book is much better than people give it credit for. And it does have a critique of rote Marxist Leninism in it. Like even that book does. And there's a critique of rote Marxist Leninism and Althusser, which probably doesn't make Lasserdians happy, for example. But I do find that very helpful. And I have just really lately been thinking about where we are with so many of these thinkers, and how we have kind of underserved them, and that we have just sort of accepted like the end of the new left or end of the new communist movement, like conclusions about them, and then not really gone back to them until very recently. And particularly, I mean, I think that's true for both Althusser and Lukács. Like, there's not been a thorough going through of what one really needs to do to deal with everything you should deal with to be able to use them today, because we're stuck on particular text, or we're stuck in a particular moment of time, or we read this person like in a flash flame of like where they're at one moment, and we leave it there. Now, and I say this, I'm not one of these people who thinks that we should always, like, everybody needs to know everything about every critical theorist if you're going to be a Marxist. In fact, I think most Marxists really kind of don't. But some of us need to figure that out and not just accept that where we were at in the past. We have been going for a while. I want to let you go and finish your night. But do you have any concluding thoughts in that vein?
Yeah, I mean, I think like going back to like the one, like, yeah, like regardless like of the differences between like those lists of people that you mentioned that I participate with, like I think like as a young thinker and theorist, because like I'm only like 28, so like you know, I'm coming, yeah, I'm coming, yeah, like I'm like coming to this stuff like brand new. Like, well, I got into like philosophy when I was like 16, 17, but like political theory wasn't like until like COVID psychoanalysis around the same time. I was still doing my service in the military, and so like I got radicalized around that time. And so like, you know, not being in the university, I'm like relying like a lot of like, you know, people that have been participating with like online and stuff like that. But like being able to develop my own thought, I think it was helpful from psychoanalysis, because it's like being able to limit myself to one thinker and not feeling like I had to read every single thing that everybody was reading to be able to be like, okay, now I'm finally on the same plane as everybody else. It's like, no, you're never going to be. But I think like limiting myself to just being like mainly, not only, but just mainly a Lacanian has, I guess, granted me the sort of discipline to be able to be like, okay, what thinker am I going to read next? And I think like, regardless of like the amount of Marxist literature I've read and thinkers that I would align with, like, you know, I mentioned, yeah, I like Lacerda. Yeah, I like Althusser. Yeah, I'm slowly getting into Lukács. I wouldn't consider myself, you know, a Lacerdian as much as I would even consider myself an Althusserian, but I guess because of the Lacanian baggage I carry, Althusser is sort of going to be there. So like Althusser would be somebody that I would grapple with. But I would say Badu is someone that like I'm slowly like aligning with a bit more. And I mentioned him once in our interview, Karatani. I really feel like Karatani is someone who's not mentioned enough, and someone who I really align with his idea of like world history and world system stuff. And so like I am working on some I have some projects formulated around those specific thinkers that I listed, like you know, Badu and Karatani in the forefronts. But I mean, I really don't have anything else to say, but just like, yeah, like psychoanalysis, you know, because our whole conversation was like on psychoanalysis and Marxism. Like it's not a happy marriage. It's not like a sort of like two systems that we could just be like, okay, they fit together like hand in glove. But I do think that they do offer a sort of insight to one another, which each field lacks. And I do think that, yeah, at the end of the day, Marxism does, you know, have a primacy because of the critique of political economy, right? That unfortunately psychoanalysis doesn't, but the way in which we talked about like group formations, identifications, and these schisms, I do think psychoanalysis has a bit more nuanced and does have a better theory of subjectivity that Marx really didn't really talk about.
This is I know that it's going to be Orthodox Marxists who get mad at me for saying this, but there's a theory of mind-shaped hole in Marxism that's kind of implied, but it's never worked out in Marx, and it's not really in Engels either. I've really tried to look. There is kind of an emergencist theory of consciousness, like things exist in the world and they emerge because they're most likely used for that. But like, and I think E.P. Thompson kind of works this out, but unfortunately, and I know we have our critiques of empiricism, but empirical studies do not bear that out as the way people actually think. So it's, and more so, it's just underbaked. It's not really fleshed out how the individual works versus how they relate to class consciousness versus how they relate to ideological imposition. It's just not worked out. I mean, that's one thing that Balabar is clear on, and Althusser is clear on, and even Badu is clear on. From what I've read, I haven't read everything by Badu in English, but like I've read a lot of it.
I would say one. I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, but I would say like the Badu guy that you need to interview if you haven't already is Chris Manor. I don't know if you follow him. He's known as
I
Logic.
do not follow him, but I have seen some of his stuff and been impressed by it. But go ahead.
Yeah, Logics of Worlds. Yeah, I would recommend talking with him, and I think he could really give a good argument on like the relevance of Badu more than I could.
Oh, hey, awesome. Yeah. All right, yeah. Very quickly, where can people find your stuff, Andrew?
Yeah, so I on YouTube I have 2 channels: the Parallax Viewer, which you reference, the Vanishing Mediators. You could follow me on Instagram or Twitter at the Big Signorelli. And I also have a Medium blog in which I write about Lacan. I did write one thing on Lazarus and Badu, but it was just like a sort of like my own like thoughts. Yeah, I'm working on like my own blog to develop more of my writing. So you could find me on there on the named Big Signorelli as well, and Substack. But yeah, that's where you could find me. Yeah, feel free to, if you can't, hit me up on Instagram or Twitter, and I can link you that in the DMs. But yeah.
All right. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your evening.
Thank you as well, comrade. Peace.
All right. Peace.